There was a certain point in time when it became pretty clear that every Final Fantasy game was gonna get a sequel of some kind. When X-2 came out, you could have assumed it was a one-off thing, but then the compilation of Final Fantasy VII happened, 11 got a bunch of expansions, and 12 got Revenant Wings for the DS. Final Fantasy IV also retroactively got a sequel with the After Years, but please don't make me talk about that one. A series that's defining trait was being able to jump into any game in any order at any time was slowly shifting into one where every entry was being turned into a mini-series of its own. And, I mean, it kinda makes sense. Sure, it's no problem to completely separate 1, 2, and 3 when they all looked like this, but starting with the PS2 generation, development costs started skyrocketing, and it made a lot of financial sense to put already done assets to work for a second time in a direct sequel. So, when Final Fantasy XIII dropped in late 2009, it was a question of when, not if, Square Enix was gonna follow it up. And follow it up they did. Final Fantasy XIII-2 released blazing hot on the heels of its predecessor, coming out less than 2 years after, a time frame that seems even quicker when you remember that Square Enix were the kings of taking a literal decade to develop shit in the 2010s. The team definitely saw the reception 13 was getting, and wanted to push out a sequel as soon as they could, to address the issues people had with it and turn public opinion back on their side. So, did XIII-2 manage to pull it off? It's not that simple. We'll get into it. Would I recommend you watch my video on the first Final Fantasy XIII game before this one? Yeah, definitely, but it's also like an hour long, so if you're only interested in XIII-2, I can totally understand skipping it. Speaking of that video, big thanks to everyone who watched it, really. I honestly did not expect it to get the views and supportive comments it did. So, given that video's reception, I figured it was about time to get a big boy mic, which is why I probably sound so different right now. Trust me, I'm getting used to it too. Anyways, as for endgame spoilers, I'll talk about them near the end, and I'll give you a heads up before I get into it. With all that out of the way, let's get talking about the middle entry in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. I want to quick establish what Final Fantasy XIII-2 is going to be about. Give us some context to what we're working with, you know? Pretty much exactly the same as the first game, XIII-2 starts off with a, dare I say, lavish CG cutscene as soon as you hit that new game button. We've got our main character from the last game, Lightning, fighting some purple guy whose sword looks almost copyright infringingly like the Soul Edge. They have a big multi-phase hashtag epic battle for a few minutes, before Lightning screams out his name for us, the viewer's benefit. His name is Caius Ballad, and he's going to serve as the main antagonist to the game. The logo flashes, then the game does an admittedly good for 2011 transition from CGI cutscene to gameplay. Since we established in the last video that the Final Fantasy XIII series was ultimately shaped by the era it came out in, we can make a pretty good guess that Square wanted to have the player experience some gameplay as soon as possible, since the growing trend at the time was pushed back against long, drawn-out cutscenes. Our total title screen to battle all cutscene speedrun ran about 3 minutes this go around, but the battle isn't really anything special. Sure, it looks cool, you're playing as Lightning riding a horse firing lightning bolts at a dragon, but it is kind of the tutorial, so it can't really go too hard. You mostly just wait for your ATB bar to slowly fill up so you can queue up a few attacks, heal up when you get too low, and chip down the boss's health until the next cutscene starts. Understandably, even though it looks like a final boss fight, they can't exactly backhand you across the face with a real challenge 90 seconds after you've hit the new game button. It's at least better than every single boss fight in Chapter 1 of 13. Also, you want to know how this fight ends? It had me in stitches. I was crying laughing. It literally finishes off with a multi-part QuickTime event cutscene. It almost feels like a parody. I totally forgot that this was a common trend back then. This is one of those things where you can look at it and immediately know the exact time frame a game was released in. It's either that, or the Mass Effect costumes were a dead giveaway. Man, what is this even? I've also got to mention something about the QTEs. They're basically a lie. So, I'm playing the PC version of XIII-2, which, by the way, is completely busted. OG 13's was as well, but this is on another level, as evidenced by the Steam reviews. I've got like 10 mods working in tandem to duct tape this thing together. Everything from a mod that keeps it from crashing every 5 minutes to a mod that patches out the rain effect that looks like it's straight out of the GTA trilogy. Since this was a totally hard worked on PC port of the game, there's no way to remap your controller layout, and that's, surprise surprise, also broken. I'm using the same PS4 controller I used with the first 13, same setup, same everything, but XIII-2 just decided it's not playing by the rules. I tried to fix it, and I'm sure I could have used X input or something to force the right button configuration, but it's an RPG, so I figured I'd just roll with it. The layout isn't even logical. Square is X, circle is square, triangle is still triangle, and to top it off, the PC port uses Xbox controller prompts for everything. All that said, you probably think that this would have made the QTEs impossible to do, and considering the game uses them to cap off every major boss fight, it sounds like I might be in a bit of trouble. Well, fortunately for me, the game doesn't track any inputs you make during the QTE sections, except for the correct one. So, every time they came up, I just put the brain switch in the off position, spun the stick in a circle, and mashed all the face buttons at the same time. Got perfect on every single one. Back to the intro. After Lightning beats Caius, one of the game's protagonists, Noel, comes floating down from the sky. Look, just don't think about it too much. Lightning catches him and asks him to lead her sister Sarah to her so they can change the future. Noel, asking suspiciously few questions for a guy who just got sucked into another dimension in the middle of a walk or something, agrees to find her, and Lightning entrusts him with a Moogle that can turn into a bow. Noel is from the future, you see, the literal end of time, which is a lot closer than you'd probably hope it would be, and he's the last surviving human. I think it's a really cool concept for a character, and it means he's already got plenty motivation for changing the future so that his nightmare world doesn't occur. Caius shows up ready for a run back, so Lightning sends Noel through a time gate to where Sarah is, a beachside town on Pulse 3 years after the fall of Cocoon. She's having a fever dream or something when a meteor shows up with Noel and a bunch of monsters hitchhiking on it. She's having a dream about lightning when suddenly her clothes transform. For reasons. She heads out, hallucinates for a few seconds, then meets Noel, who gives her the Moogle. We're introduced to some proper gameplay, and interestingly, have access to the paradigm system right off the bat, a decision likely made due to the criticism towards 13 for not having its defining gameplay system until 5 hours in. So, everything's set up, we've got our two main characters, our goal, which is get to Lightning and change the future, and we head off to fight this discount anima from Final Fantasy X. I just have one thing to say, and it's kinda small, but it's gonna lead into a little bit of criticism. Why can Sarah use magic? Final Fantasy XIII made a really big deal that magic was a l'Cie only thing. People freak out when they see magic because it 100% means that the person who used it is a l'Cie. But now Sarah is just casually using it in the first battle, and no one's saying anything about it. There's later scenes in XIII-2 where Sarah questions why she has the power to travel through time, but she never questions why she can use magic. Sure, maybe she can use magic because of Mog, the Moogle, but then what's the reason for Noel being able to? I was ready to believe that the devs forgot the rules of the world that they themselves built when I finally stumbled upon my answer. It turns out that after Cocoon fell at the end of the last game, some people spontaneously gained the ability to use magic, and Sarah was one of them. Shaky reasoning made for gameplay purposes? Sure, but the reason I'm criticizing it is because of where I found it. It was on a random page in Final Fantasy XIII-2's datalog. If you'll remember, I defended 13 about this in the last video. A common criticism of that game was that the majority of the world building was found in the datalog, and I argued that the game answers all of its whys and hows during the game itself. Whereas for the Final Fantasy XIII video, I could tell you the lore of the world without ever looking at the datalog. I already have to resort to it just to know how magic works in XIII-2. Sure, you could argue that this is a nitpick, but I really enjoy when a game creates a set of rules for its world and follows them, and also properly tells those rules to the player. Especially when I particularly singled out that point for the last game and praised it. You don't need to know something as trivial as how magic work, but is it indicative of a trend where Final Fantasy XIII-2 fails to create as compelling of a world as its predecessor did? Stick around and find out. So, that was the intro, and the only question I have at the current moment in time is, what the fuck is going on here? And it's probably not just me. Everyone who played 13 is probably wondering how we got from that game's happy ending to Lightning's Monster Hunter adventure in the Lightning Dimension. This isn't in media res either. This is where XIII-2's story starts off. So, how exactly did we get here? Well, the game does cover it briefly, but the full answer was released in a book alongside XIII-2 in Japan, and oh boy have I seen this before. I'll give you the spark notes. So basically, at the end of 13, all 6 of our protagonists were meant to get the crystal treatment like Vanille and Fang. Feeling pity on them, the goddess Etro intervened, but in doing so, she cracked the timeline open like an egg. That's not the last time you'll hear that name, so keep it in mind for later. Because of that, and I say this with no exaggeration, lightning literally falls down a hole and disappears, and the only one who can remember she was there is Sarah. Lightning ends up in Valhalla, where she finds the goddess Etro weak and agrees to be her knight to protect what's left of the timeline. This apparently requires a clothing transformation, because why not? Look, I know I've made that joke like 3 times, but I'm really starting to get the suspicion that the game's director, Motomu Toriyama, was a big fan of these clothing transformation sequences. I can't blame him, just, like, don't make it so obvious, you know? This next part isn't in my script, I just noticed it while I was getting footage of XIII-2's intro. Toriyama was the director of that game as well, and 30 seconds in, what do you know, we've got a clothing transformation sequence. I mean, XIII-2 is all about changing your clothes. My man is not being subtle here. Anyways, I've got a lot more to say about the story, which I will later on, but for now, that's everything you need to know to be caught up with where we're beginning in XIII-2. With our setup out of the way, let's move on to the gameplay. If you're already familiar with the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIII, a lot of this probably looks pretty familiar to you. You've got your ATB gauge that slowly fills up so you can use your abilities, the paradigm system remains largely unchanged, and battles play out mostly like you'd expect them to. The difference comes then with what is changed from XIII, and there's probably a lot more than you'd expect. First off, there were some subtle changes in the game's roles. In XIII, each character had 3 roles they were good at. Near the end of the game, you could technically have them do any of the 6, but they could only perform basic functions in their other 3. In XIII-2, you have a lot more flexibility with which roles you want to give to your main characters. The game is balanced around having them either be extremely good at 3 roles, or so-so in 5 or 6 by the end of the story. While the game does push Noel towards being a physical attacker and Sarah being a magic user, those aren't necessarily set in stone. Different weapons can give each character the stats they need to essentially fill any position. The roles also got more defined traits beyond the skills they use as well. There's changes to stats depending on which role you're in, but the biggest example I can think of is the changes they made to Sentinel. In XIII, the Sentinel was a tank role you'd have a character take to draw aggro so your other characters could heal and buff without getting third party. It came with a passive buff to defense in XIII as well, but it was pretty much on par with the stats you'd expect a tank character to have in any other Final Fantasy game. In XIII-2, the passive buff your characters get to defense for just existing in the Sentinel role is so high, it means that switching to a 3 Sentinel setup is basically a block button. This isn't some fringe hidden strategy. Bosses often have a big attack with a long windup, giving you a decent amount of time to switch to avoid damage. It's also a near-essential mechanic for the Lightning DLC episode, which we'll talk about later, so I don't think it's an accidental thing. Changes like this and more make the paradigm system feel more dynamic than in the first game. Whereas Final Fantasy XIII's paradigm system felt like swinging a pendulum to keep the battle in your favor, XIII-2's is more like reacting quickly to your opponent's moves and then knowing what to do to push the advantage. It's a lot more fast-paced, where you make constant small decisions that affect the outcome of a battle. I still wish you could manually control characters though. Love how they just slowly walk into AoE attacks they're already out of the way of. I'm sure for both games, you can play at a basic level and still get by brute forcing through leveling up, but learning the nuances of each system can really make for a better, more challenging play experience. Which is why it's a shame that XIII-2 totally fumbles in terms of difficulty. Say what you will about XIII, because of the fact that game was so linear and caps your level progress based on where you are in the story, it pretty much knew exactly how strong you were at any given moment. That way, fights were never too easy or too difficult. Most fights had a decent chance to kill you if you tried to mash through them, but were never outright impossible. I'm gonna go into length about XIII-2's structure, but for now, just know that it's extremely non-linear. Because of this, go off the beaten path and do too many side quests, and the game just ends up being too easy. Streamline the main quest, and you'll quickly find it becoming too hard. There's definitely a balance here, but I did what I think is a fair amount of side content. I mean, I didn't go do every optional quest I had at any given moment, but for a non-insignificant part of the game, I could basically turn my brain off and get by. There are entire areas where I could get away with not having to paradigm switch at all during normal encounters. It's not a game-breaking problem, but I gave the first 13 particular praise for having a smooth difficulty curve in my last video, so it's a shame that the balance couldn't be kept for the sequel. Obviously, if you feel too powerful, skipping battles is always an option, but then I have the opposite problem. The game usually spikes in difficulty at the start of a new chapter, meaning if I start avoiding too many battles, I run the risk of being too underpowered. I understand that this is probably an unavoidable consequence of the non-linear design. I just wish there weren't so many battles I had to mash through. Overall, when the balance is on point, yeah, 13-2 is a better, more dynamic version of 13's battle system. It's just a shame that the game can't keep that balance in check for a good chunk of its runtime. Speaking of skipping battles, 13-2 does something I'm pretty sure no other RPG series has done before and goes back to a random encounter system from a non-random one. For context, before this, the last time a mainline Final Fantasy game had random encounters was 10-2, a full 8 years before. That being said, the battles in 13-2 aren't entirely random. You're walking around the map minding your own business, and after some algorithm decides you've taken an appropriately random number of steps, an enemy pops up. Standard stuff. A timer appears at the bottom of your screen, and you've got two options. You can either bail out before the timer runs out and the enemy decides it's time to go in, or you can choose to fight. The preemptive strike system from 13 makes a return, but it's gone through a lot of changes. If you wanted to get a pre-battle advantage on the overworld in 13, you had to get to an enemy before they were able to spot you, then you awkwardly mash your face up against their booty cheeks. 13-2 improves this system heavily by giving you a lot more agency. This time, you press a button to swing your sword. You know, like a video game. If you land the first hit, you get a preemptive strike. If you miss, the battle plays out normally. Because it's a lot easier to pull off, this time around, the battle starts with a 120% increase on the enemy's stagger gauge and a haste buff for your party, rather than putting them 1 point away from full stagger like in 13. I think I speak for everyone when I say I prefer this system to the old one. It just feels better to actually swing your sword to start a battle. I mean, we know it's better, because it's the direction most RPG series have gone with in the #modern era. I'm not gonna pretend 13-2 was the first RPG to do something like this. The earliest example I can personally think of is Persona 3, but it was definitely ahead of the curve as far as the genre goes. There are some flaws with this system, like if you're in a narrow corridor, you've probably got no chance to avoid the battle, and there are some levels that are basically made of random corridors, believe you me, but this was an issue in 13 as well. At least you can actually do something about it this time. A lot of the other changes to the gameplay mostly consist of two things: quality of life changes and backdowns. Let's start with column A. When your lead character dies, you no longer game over. Instead, you switch to the other one. Glad they realized that wasn't the greatest idea last time around. Speaking of switching characters, you couldn't change your lead character mid-battle at all in the first 13. This usually didn't matter, but there were some times where it did get kind of frustrating. For example, I'd say I'm way more efficient at applying buffs than the auto-battle synergist AI is, so I'd usually set Noel, my main synergist, as my lead character. However, during some fights, I specifically want Sarah, my saboteur, to cast a poison spell, something the AI will usually only do after they've afflicted said enemy with D-Shell and D-Protect. In 13, you'd have to settle for either one inconvenience or the other, but in 13-2, I can essentially take control of any role when and if I need it, which is a bigger improvement than you'd expect. The ranking system also makes a return, and while it's still based on some arbitrary fairy world formula that takes into account your level, the enemy layout, and battle time, it's at least a bit more transparent than the last game. I'm pretty sure 13 awarded you with extra TP and a higher item drop percentage for a higher ranking, but I mean, I know that because I looked it up on the wiki. 13-2 clearly displays what you're getting when you hit 5 stars. You can still pretty much ignore this whole system entirely, but hey, at least they tried. The Crystarium also saw a bit of a change, but it's not really worth going into too much detail about. It's still a simple system that's a far cry away from the sphere grid, but this time it's a loop instead of a tree. There's this one new mechanic called the wound damage system, and it affects how much of your maximum health you can recover during battle, kinda like how Final Fantasy XV did it. It's meant to prevent you from fighting enemies that are way above your level, but 9 times out of 10, they'll just kill you normally rather than slowly grinding out your maximum health. I can safely say that this mechanic had almost no impact on my playthrough outside of when I challenged the final boss at a lower level than I probably should have. Even in that scenario though, there's a potion you can suck back that totally negates its effects. It's just a mechanic that was kind of implemented without too much thought. You could remove it entirely and not much would change, and if that's the case, what's the point, you know? Lastly, this is the first mainline Final Fantasy with a jump button. Do with that information what you will. So now for the backdowns. For better or worse, 13 made a lot of changes to the RPG formula that were meant to address a lot of the inherent, quote, issues with the genre. While they may have been well-intentioned, I can't say that all of them were for the better, and most of the changes weren't well received by the public at large. A lot of 13's more controversial changes were moved back to how they worked in the previous games for 13-2. For example, Gil is now earned at the end of every battle. In the last video, I mentioned you could do a no-guild challenge run of 13, and it would maybe make the game 15% harder. For 13-2, guild returns to being a primary resource. You need it to buy items, upgrade materials for your monsters, and etc. Now look, I get it. I've heard the point that it's weird to get money after killing a wolf or something like you just mugged it. I don't disagree. I'm just saying that from a gameplay perspective, it feels a lot better to earn money from battles than it does to earn money from killing certain enemies that may or may not drop an item that you can later sell for money. If Final Fantasy XIII ran on the barter system with its material drops, 13-2 is definitely a return to the free market, since the weapon system has been completely overhauled as well. You no longer upgrade weapons. 13-2 returns to a system similar to previous Final Fantasy games, where a weapon you have is what you get. There are technically upgraded versions of certain weapons in the shop which require you to trade in a few items to buy, but they're by far the majority. Unlike the last game, where you were usually forced to commit to upgrading a single weapon, 13-2 definitely lets you use a wider variety than 13 did, but I have a few issues with the system. So you remember how 13 merged the save points in the item shop into some lazy-looking floating computer that showed up every 5 meters? Instead of that, this time around, you have this dimension-hopping character named Chocolina that basically has the same function. As for saving your game, you can basically do that anywhere. So their way of fixing the shop issue was turning it into a girl in chocobo cosplay that makes mildly entertaining puns. Points for originality, I guess? She's also got a dark secret, but that's going into the spoiler section, so get hyped for that. While you can find weapons, which are the only form of equipment besides accessories by the way, through exploration, the majority will be obtained through the shop. This means most times, your strategy for getting new weapons is to enter a new area, find Chocolina, and quickly scroll down the list to see if she has anything better than your current stuff. Gun to my head, I guess I'd say it's better than 13's upgrade system where you basically had to put a ring on whatever weapon you decided to use, but it still needed a lot of work. Lastly, let's go into the biggest gameplay change. Maybe the gameplay change. You might have noticed from the gameplay I've been showing so far, but something's going on over there with that third party member. You see, in Final Fantasy XIII-2, Noel and Sarah are the only two real party members you have for the entire game. The third slot's going to be filled up by this game's new mechanic, the monster capture system. The way it works is, after a battle, you have a chance to abduct and enslave a member of the enemy party, who you then assign to a paradigm pack. You can assign 3 monsters to the pack, and each monster can use a single paradigm, so you essentially use them to fill out the roles that Noel and Sarah can't cover. In theory, this should make it so that making paradigms essentially functions the same as it did in 13. In practice, it works most of the time. So here's thing 1, you're likely gonna make Sarah a Ravager and Noel a Commando. Even if you're a big renegade, you'll probably just reverse those 2 roles between them. I already told you how the Sentinel role works, so you'll probably assign them to that as well. After that, you'll want them to fill out some other roles that complement their first ones, so I leveled up Sarah as a Saboteur and a Medic, and Noel as a Synergist. Now, what monsters do I need? I'll want a Sentinel, that's for sure, so that's 1 monster slot. A Commando Ravager paradigm is near essential, so I'll have to pick up one of those as well, and all of a sudden, my choices just got a whole lot more limited. It's less of making a team based on the cool monsters you want to use, and more of just filling the roles you need filled. In Final Fantasy XIII, every character had an equal weight in the party, so even if you had role overlap, you usually had 1 main person and 1 sub-person for the role split between 2 people. For example, Vanille was my go-to medic, but Lightning could step up when I needed it. In 13-2, since 2 party members have clearly greater weight here, and the monsters are meant to be swapped out as the game progresses, party composition feels more like deciding what niches to open up for the monsters to fill. Noel and Sarah are likely going to be your primary for everything, unless you deliberately leave a role that neither of them can do. This all has the downside of making party composition feel a lot more limited. Thing 2 is that the game often doesn't provide you with monsters that are evenly distributed between the different roles. We've got 15 commandos in this one area, yes, but can your boy just get a whiff of medic? I've been using the cat you gave me in the second battle for the last 6 hours. You level up these monsters using material drops you get from battle, and while it is dangerously skirting the line of something that might require farming, I never had to go out of my way to get these items until the very end of the game, which is fair. I was pushing the top few levels, so it does make sense I would have to go out of my way for that final strength boost. You can also fuse your monsters together to pass on certain skills and boosts, like a budget SMT, and while it is about as complex as mass fusing all the monsters you don't need into the big boys you actually plan on using, it did give a bit of a sense that I was creating my own custom monsters. Your monsters can also use pseudo-limit breaks called Feral Links in battle, but they're not really anything special besides giving you another opportunity to do more quick-time events.
お前はもう死んでいる。何？
Overall, the monster system isn't perfect. It could use a bit of work in expanding upon, and if I left it at that, it might seem like a perfectly usable system. My main criticism of the monster system isn't purely gameplay based, however. Rather, it's from a story perspective. I think pretty much everyone agreed that Final Fantasy XIII's story was primarily character driven, with its strength being its diverse cast. And now for XIII-2, they've totally flipped that, with the amount of party members you have being the same amount of fingers you need to do a peace sign. Now don't get me wrong, Dragon Quest V is one of my favorite RPGs, and that game basically invented the monster catching mechanic. I have no deep prejudice for this system. Monsters in XIII-2 do totally have a functional purpose that they serve well, I'm just disappointed that it results in us only getting 2 main characters. 2.5, if you count the Moogle. With each character usually only having a single other personality to play off of, it makes the interaction between the main cast a lot more limited than it was in 13. It kind of feels like the whole reason we even have the monster capture system is because the devs decided that this was going to be Sarah and Noel's story, pat themselves on the back, and then started sweating when the intern asked what they were going to do about the other party members. I'm not saying that there needs to be a perfectly justified plot reason for why Sarah can control monsters, but even still, this whole thing is just kind of there. You get the tutorial in the first level where you're introduced to the mechanic, the characters go, wow, cool, and then it's never mentioned again. The only justification I could find anywhere for this was something about the strong commanding the weak being the law of Valhalla, and Sarah saw lightning command beasts in the dream, so she can do it too. Once again, I only know this because I was digging deep into the data log. I'll talk about how only having 2 main characters affects the game as a whole in a sec, but for the monster system, just know this. I get this game was built around Nera and Sol. Nah, I'm leaving that in. And they couldn't exactly go adding in a bunch of random characters to be party members. I just wish they gave it a bit more thought during its implementation. Overall, my take from the gameplay is while there's a lot of steps forward, there were quite a few steps back as well. It's interesting to see the amount of subtle and significant changes the devs implemented to try and steer the ship away from 13's cold reception. Moving on to something I think is a lot less controversial, however, I want to take a quick look at the visuals. A quick look because there isn't too much to say that I haven't already said in the last video. Reusing the same engine as 13, it would stand to reason that XIII-2 would look very similar, and surprise surprise, it does. Of course, with the passage of time, 13's literal console-defining visuals would start to become relatively less impressive as other games caught up, but in 2011, XIII-2 was still well ahead of the pack. This is still very true in the visual design of the different areas. While a lot of 13's environments were reused in XIII-2, the completely original ones are what I'd say shine the brightest. There's this one level called Academia that you visit during both night and daytime, and not only does it look great in general, it's the contrast that really makes it stand apart. Visually, this is probably my favorite area in the game, and it's not just because I'm a sucker for its Blade Runner aesthetic. I think the best comparison for XIII-2's visual upgrade is the small increments that Valve was making to the Half-Life 2 games with every episode. Back when, you know, Valve made games. XIII-2 makes some noted improvements to the character models this time around, particularly in the textures. I first noticed this when a scene with Snow started playing and I noticed he had age lines near his eyes. My first thought was, how old was Snow again? And after looking it up and finding out he's meant to be 23, my thought changed to, he's 23, why does he have age lines? My second thought was, bro, Sarah's 18 in Final Fantasy XIII. What are you doing? I was 10 minutes into wondering what Square Enix thought a 23-year-old looked like when I realized, hey, those are some pretty good face details for 2011. And if you're wondering, yeah, they did address the issue with the character's horrifying sausage fingers as well. By making every main character wear gloves. Hey, at least they knew, right? CG cutscenes also look as good as they did before, which is to say they look incredible, but I should note that there are far fewer of them this time around. That combined with the fact that this game renders cutscenes that use the in-game models in real time, rather than having them pre-rendered like 13 did, significantly cut down on the game's file size for its original release. That means it could ship on 1 disc for Xbox 360 instead of 4. This also inadvertently fixed the audio buzzing issue that the PC port of 13 had, since those exclusively happened during the in-game model pre-rendered cutscenes. I'm also a big fan of the 2D art in this game. Particularly, I'm a big fan of this art of lightning and chaos on the title screen done by Final Fantasy legend Yoshitaka Amano. Maybe it was due to this game's short development cycle, but a lot of the attention to detail the first game had didn't make it over to this one. Things like the stylish menus have been replaced with 3D models of the characters floating in the center of the screen. Also, this might be an issue that's very specific to me, but there's this one scene where Noel and Sarah are having an emotional conversation, and there's a stupid treasure box bobbing right behind where Sarah's sitting. Like, could you just not have it show up while the cutscene's playing? Or if you can't do that, maybe don't put it right there? Was it impossible to stick it 5 meters to the left? I don't know. Now so far, I've been mixed on a lot of stuff about XIII-2. What I can say with full confidence is an aspect of this game I have almost zero complaints about is the music. I said that despite not being composed by Nobuo Uematsu, I had a lot of love for the original 13 soundtrack. I think it's really good, and I particularly like the themes for the 6 main characters. I gotta say though, 13-2 soundtrack is an improvement in almost every way. Again, this video is obviously going to be filled with 13-2's music, so keep an ear out and decide what you think of it. A few months after Final Fantasy XIII released, it was announced that the composer, Masashi Hamauzu, was leaving Square Enix. While this may have seemed like a disappointment for those who liked his compositions, it turns out that that was basically a bold-faced lie. While Hamauzu's still technically not affiliated with the company, he's never really stopped composing for Final Fantasy games, even up till present day. Along with the 13 trilogy, he did the remastered soundtrack for Final Fantasy X HD, and he was even the head composer on last year's VII Remake. There's a lot more diversity in the genres this time around, which is a big improvement on 13's piano/orchestral focus. There's a lot of vocal tracks. Some are kinda weird though, like the Brescia Ruins theme telling you not to be ashamed of your race or the place you're from. Good advice, I just didn't expect to hear it as the background track to the swamp level. Also, I know you've probably heard this one somewhere before. So you think you can ride this chocobo? Got chocobo, you better climb on the chocobo. Settle up if you think you can ride in this rodeo. You know, they also do the same thing 13 did, where a main character's theme is repurposed as a battle theme with a new arrangement to give the track a completely different mood. My internet search abilities tell me that this is called a leitmotif, so I'm gonna call it that to sound like I've got big brain. If it's wrong, it's not my fault. The character getting this treatment this go around is our secondary main character, Noel. Noel's theme encapsulates the sadness that comes with living at the end of the world. It's the loneliness that accompanies being the last human alive. Then for the battle theme, it's pumped up to give you that adrenaline hit. Despite getting the raw steel in Final Fantasy XIII history, Noel is still filled with determination, a desire to change the future, and that really comes through in this track. Give it a listen for a few seconds. Lastly, this is kinda minor, but I turn into a drooling moron whenever the words adaptive music show up. In 13-2, it's subtle, but whenever an enemy appears, an alternate, more energetic version of the area's theme starts to play. It only lasts for the few seconds before you hit the enemy, but I'm a sucker for this kind of shit. We're getting close to talking about the big meat of this game, the structure, but before that, I want to talk about the characters real quick. Sarah got a redesign, and apparently her artist was told specifically to take inspiration from Ava's plug suits, so that's pretty cool. Despite being the main character, however, I don't think Sarah ranks very highly on 13-2's food chain. It's our new characters, Noel, Caius, and Yule, that really steal the show. I already mentioned Noel's backstory and how strong it is. He's the last human being alive, and he had to watch the remaining population slowly die off. Coming from a world like that, he understands the true value of life, a philosophy that's told not only through his dialogue, but his action, and that'll be relevant later. He does suffer a bit from Square Enix shoehorning him as the I didn't play Final Fantasy XIII character. People will exposit dialogue about Cocoon and Pulse's backstory at him constantly. Also, he suffers from convenient memory loss, because obviously, him knowing everything means there would kinda be no mystery to the plot. Overall, yeah, Noel is written really well, but if you ask me who the best character is, it's hands down our villain Caius. One point of criticism 13 had to wear on its chest was its lack of a central villain. There was Barthandelus, but he shows up like 3 times total, and the final boss of that game makes their first appearance about 10 minutes before the credits. Taking that L in stride and fixing the problem, I gotta say that Caius is probably one of the best written villains in a Final Fantasy game. He's the kind of villain where you might not agree with his methods, but you can't deny that he makes some good points. His character only gets better when combined with his relationship to other newcoming characters? Yule. Aside from being another Christmas pun along with Noel, Yule, who is actually many characters that all look the same and have the same name, is a Cirrus from a tribe of people who lived on Pulse. Remember earlier I mentioned the goddess Etro? Yeah, I had to Control F that right now just to make sure I brought her up before. So Etro's remains are broken up into two parts, the Heart of Chaos and the Eyes of Etro, which Caius and Yule both have respectively. Caius, as Yule's guardian, is essentially immortal because of the heart, and he's tasked with watching over her many incarnations. Yule, on the other hand, can see the timeline with the Eyes of Etro, but is cursed to always die extremely young, accelerated by the amount of times she sees the timelines change, something she has no control over. She's always reborn, but while it's still Yule, she's a different person, if you get what I mean. Caius wants to break the timeline to free Yule from this cycle of life and death, right? Since we know Caius has been serving as Yule's guardian for approximately 700 years, we can calculate about how many of her incarnations that he's watched over. Factoring in that each Yule lives until about 15 years old, I'm gonna estimate that Caius has had to watch Yule grow up, suffer, and die about 46.6 times. Can't blame the dude for wanting to put a stop to it. By breaking the passage of time, thereby breaking the cycle, it would throw the world into chaos, sure, but since we know the end of humanity is coming soon anyways, you can make a pretty good case that he's not entirely in the wrong here. It might technically have the side effect of preventing humanity's downfall, after all. Sarah and Noel are trying to avoid the end of humanity as well, by solving the problem at its source, but their solution would continue the timeline, continuing Yule's cycle of short life. It's a lot more complex than that, and I'll talk about it in the spoiler section, but just know that Caius is ranked pretty highly as far as Final Fantasy villains go. You want to know who didn't get proper treatment, on the other hand? Are returning characters. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a time travel plot, and the developers stated one of the reasons for this is because they wanted to tell a story with the same characters from 13 many years later. Regardless of how you feel about that statement, it rings hollow when you realize how dirty they did those characters. Other than Sarah, who was barely present in the first game at all of the other main characters get a pretty raw deal. Hope probably gets the best treatment. He's a recurring side character with a major role in the plot. He's shown to not only have grown physically, but emotionally as well. There's a scene where he's telling you about the time he almost did a Dark Souls-style backstab on Snow, and how much he regrets the way he acted and how he learned from it. Dude actually got a character arc, he's written well. In contrast to that, any Saws fans out there? See this cutscene I'm showing on the screen? Hope you like it, cause that's literally all you're gonna see of him. Lightning is important, sure, but other than the very beginning and a few scenes near the end, she's more of a goal for us to get to than an actual character. Snow? Where do I even begin with Snow? Him and Sarah were supposed to get married, right? Instead, he read too many blogs about the Sigma grind set or something and dashed off promising to find Lightning, ditching Sarah for 3 years. She even names her cat Snow. Like, my dude, Lightning's cool and all, but maybe you could visit your wife once in a while? Like, my dude, she is so down bad, she's naming the cat after you. When Noel's like, who's Snow? Sarah goes, oh, a good friend. Like, I get you find out later that he's time traveling as well, but unless he picked up Sarah when she was 15, he's been away from her longer than he's been with her at this point. Like, significantly. There's a scene where Noel talks shit about Snow for like 10 minutes straight, and Sarah just goes, haha, yeah, he's like that. He shows up for a single area of the game before he's written out of the story again. And he's also a Lassie for some reason, but that plot point never gets addressed. It's only explained why he's a Lassie in a separate book. His fal'Cie is a literal cactuar, by the way. The story arc he's in is also, how do I put it, actual bonkers. There's a dragon you see, and it's eating the tomatoes, but it's not eating the tomatoes, its stomach is a portal to the future, or maybe the past, where those tomatoes are combining into a big tomato. That big tomato is such a unit that it's melting the crystal pillar holding Cocoon up. This spooks the common folk so much that they start a war, which leads to the end of humanity. I know it's reductive to describe a part of the story like that, but you can't be telling me that a dragon eating too many tomatoes was the best they could come up with. It just stings because there are some actually powerful moments in this game's plot. 90% of everything with Caius in it is spot on. Hope's assistant is a character named Alyssa, and you slowly piece together that the only reason she's alive is because the timeline changed, creating an alternate branch where she wasn't killed. By fixing the timeline, you're essentially condemning her to death. She eventually learns this as well, and it's interesting to see a character struggle with this sort of existential crisis, especially when Hope, the person she's closest to, is one of the main people trying to set the timeline right. When you travel to the far future, you learn that Hope created a new fal'Cie, and while that's pretty high on the why the fuck would you do that list, it gets you thinking. Humanity was controlled by the fal'Cie for thousands of years, a control they only got rid of at the end of the first 13. Humanity was free to think and act for themselves, but it was only about a decade before creating a new fal'Cie became an option on the table. Maybe it's human nature to have something above them. Maybe the people of 13's world needed something to guide them, and would in turn give up that freedom for stability. Probably wasn't a good idea to give it the ability to turn people into Lassie and Seath, even though it can only do that because of an accident during its creation. It's a cool plot point that's kinda ruined a little bit because the way Sarah beats the Fal'Cie is to yell really loud at Hope when he's 300 years in the past to not make it, and it just disappears. You have to choose this from a list of options, and it's like the second dumbest sounding one. Hope later goes like, "I heard you through the timeline." No, you didn't. Final Fantasy XIII-2 does a lot of stuff like this, and in case you're not picking up what I'm putting down, let me put it this way. At its best, the game's writing has some really high highs, but it also has some very low lows, lower than the original 13 ever hit. It's a shame they couldn't keep the writing at a consistent level throughout. I've got some particular stuff to say about the ending, but again, I'll save it for the endgame spoilers section. The thing about the story and characters is that they're all tied to the game's structure, and I think it's worth going into that as well. In the last video, I had a section where I discussed 13's linearity and how that affected the game's reception. While 13 was designed around being linear, time constraints during development made it push too far in that direction, with long hallways and cramped areas. So, the question I want to ask is, how did the developers learn from those mistakes and improve for the sequel? Well, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is about as non-linear as you can get, especially plot-wise. Let me preface this by saying there's nothing inherently wrong with a time travel story. The thing is that the writers have to take a lot of care when telling them, as they can start to get confusing real fast if you're not careful. You finish the first level in XIII-2, and you're hit with this timeline map in the Historia Crux, and just looking at it exhausts me. Although, I do kind of find it funny how the abbreviation they use to measure time after the fall is AF. Kinda makes it look like, yeah, this level is 10 as fuck. There's so many branching paths, timelines that intersect with other timelines, levels that are alternate timeline versions of the other ones, it's a lot. You want my advice? Just don't worry about it. Don't think too much about the timeline at large or how the areas interact with each other. You'll save yourself a lot of headaches if you just follow the plot as it goes. Now don't get me wrong, I love me a convoluted story about intersecting timelines. I will preach my love for 13 Sentinels till the day I die. XIII-2 just doesn't feel like it was set up to have you think about it in that way. I can appreciate they wanted to tell the plot through a non-linear narrative, it's just not handled the best. Actually, it's best experienced as a linear narrative. You can technically do a few areas out of order, but it seems like the game's not set up for you to do that. For example, I went through the wrong time gate and accidentally did the area with snow in it earlier than I should have. After doing that, I went to the area where I was supposed to go to, and Sarah was talking to Hope and they mentioned they hadn't seen Snow in years and wondered what he was up to. Which was obviously kind of weird because I was literally talking to him 5 minutes ago. He's fine, he's just really obsessed with NFTs now or something. It reinforces what I said. Just play the path the game hands out to you. Take it as it comes, and you'll have a much better time. So how about the individual areas themselves? Right off the bat, you can see that the team knew they had to make some improvements on 13's level design. When you get control of your characters outside of battle for the first time, you're gonna notice what's different pretty quickly. It really feels like they tried to put their best foot forward here. You've immediately got a bunch of NPCs with speech bubbles over their head that you can actually walk up and talk to. It only took 2 years of R&D and millions of yen worth of budget, but by God, they finally did it. Levels are broken up with conversations between the main characters and NPCs, and you can even choose different dialogue options in some sections. The different options can get you some varied responses, but it's kinda weird how there always seems to be an option to purposely make Sarah sound like a moron.
これは密室殺人事件。直ちに捜査開始ね。まずは第一発見者への聞き込みと現場検証。容疑者を洗い出して完全犯罪のアリバイを崩そう。
熱意はわかるが、方向が間違ってないか。
There's a lot of optional cutscenes as well. A bit of wandering in the first area led to a cutscene where Sarah tells Noel how they grow vegetables on Pulse. Minor, yeah, but stuff like this goes a long way towards building a world. Now, where's the optional cutscene explaining why Sarah can use magic? We can talk about vegetables, but you didn't want to put that one in, huh? I got my first side quest by randomly speaking to this NPC soldier in these ruins. Turns out you can talk to like 10 different soldiers who will all give you the same quest, and sure, that's probably better from a game design perspective, especially when there was nothing marking that NPC as a side quest giver, but I was still pleasantly surprised when I first came across it. Also, this time around, we have side quests other than go here, kill monster, get rubles. I can appreciate the effort, but the other varieties usually go to a different area, pick up thing, come back, and I can't say that's a big improvement. From a purely level design standpoint, the maps in XIII-2 are more like small semi-open areas, rather than 13's maps which had a definitive start and endpoint. You're mostly given a few objectives in a given area that culminate in a fight with a boss or something, then you move on to the next one. Long gone are the point A to point B maps of 13. Check out a few maps from XIII-2. While they're not exactly labyrinths, I think you can see the difference. Now, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. 13 was linear, yes, but this isn't inherently a bad thing. A game designed around its linearity will be miles better than a half-assed thrown together open world. Linear doesn't equal bad by default. We have a ton of incredible linear games on pretty much every generation of console. The problem with 13 was its linearity was a byproduct of a rushed development cycle, rather than intentional design. That, and the reason 13 felt so linear is because you were essentially doing the same thing over and over. Walk to a yellow exclamation mark, watch a cutscene, walk to the next one, repeat. You didn't really have anything that broke up that flow. Arguably, minigames are a staple of the Final Fantasy series, and having an alternate form of gameplay to break up the routine goes a long way towards making a game feel less linear than it is. 13-2 tries to bring this back with some time gate minigames, but, they're not great. Stuff like draw a line to match the colors, spin the clock to erase all the numbers. They're a novel distraction, sure, but I don't think they add anything to the game. They're like basic early 2010s mobile games. There's also a casino area where you can do your standard slot machines, and there's even a section for chocobo racing. Again, a cool novelty, but not something I cared to spend a lot of time with. The point is, they knew it was more than map design that made 13 feel so linear, so I can appreciate the effort they put in to tackle the problem aside from just fixing the maps. This all went a long way towards making the levels in 13-2 feel less like a one-directional slog to get to the end. Now, if I ended it here, this would all sound pretty good. They took the criticism the last game got and improved on it for the sequel. They listened to the fans and they gave them what they wanted. All's well that ends well, right? Well, if you're looking at the bottom bar, we still got a bit of video to go through here. Unfortunately, this is where I have to make a bit of a tonal shift, because all was not well with 13-2. We know a lot less about this game's development than we did about 13, so it's hard to make definitive claims, but let's lay down some facts. This game's development began in April 2010, and it was released in mid-December 2011, meaning if you count time for cert, the game was in development for about 18 months total. 18 months for a AAA RPG video game. 13 was rushed out the door, and look how that ended up. I don't know what made them decide it was a good idea to rush the sequel out as well. Was it just a desire to air-quote give fans what they wanted and right 13's wrongs? Were the higher-ups at Square Enix lighting a fire under their ass to get a sequel out ASAP? Fair enough, there was a lot less work to be done this time around. The engine and assets were made, and they had developer Tri-Ace helping out, but 18 months is not enough time to make this kind of game, and it shows. 13-2 is a Unity asset flip in an age before Unity asset flips. Out of 13-2's 15 areas, 8 are stitched together reworks of 13's maps. I think the reason why Academia visually stands out so much to me is because it's one of the only areas that seems like it was made from entirely new assets. Remember Discount Anima from the beginning of this video? You fight him like 4 separate times. The reuse is heavy. I'm not going to count the number of enemies for an exact percentage on how many were reused from 13, but completely new ones are definitely an exception. It was clear the developers were listening to the backlash 13 got and paid attention to what was being criticized. The thing they focused most on was 13's linearity, but their solution to that problem seems to have lost the forest through the trees. It seemed in the developers' minds, linear equaled bad fan reception, so obviously non-linear equals good fan reception, right? This is something I'm gonna turn reactionary game design. Instead of sitting down and making legitimately good level design like, I don't know, people have been doing for decades, they made a decision based on what they thought people wanted. Well, something if you ask people what they want, they'll say faster horses, because despite being non-linear, 13-2's levels aren't exactly a huge improvement. They're just small areas that have you go back and forth to solve tasks. 13 showed greatness with one chapter that was basically a self-contained Final Fantasy prototype game in itself, and 13-2's playboxes, I'm gonna call them, failed to reach anywhere close to that height. The Arkilt Steppe returns, but this time it's like 1/10 of the size and legitimately has almost nothing going on. One of the best parts about the Steppe in 13 was seeing all the native creatures interact with each other and vibe around in the world. 13-2 having random battles, it's just an empty plane until the monsters decide it's time to phase into existence. Sections of the game that take place in the same area during a different time all reuse the exact same layout, and the most that'll be different is the time of day. The game also makes you take part in puzzles and tasks that feel like they were deliberately made to pad out the game's runtime, which is far shorter this time around. I did a substantial amount of side content, and I still hit credits around 21 hours, almost a third of the time it took me to beat the first 13. Obviously, number of hours played doesn't factor into how good a game is, but the developers clearly felt they needed to beef up that number. A sentiment which kinda plays to the game's detriment. I'd say, if you trimmed the time-wasting fluff, you probably could have finished this game in about 15 hours. Nowhere is this padding more apparent than in 2 very specific places. The first is at about the 70% mark, the game makes you do a Metroid Prime style backtrack of areas you've already been to collect some key items. Doesn't sound so bad, but let me try to describe to you how tedious this is. You have to go to the maps that you've already been to find an extremely hard to see transparent floating thing, use your Moogle power to pick it up, and then move on to the next on the list. There's no challenge here. There's nothing new, no new enemies, no new cutscenes, you just comb the area top to bottom till you find a barely visible floating thing. This isn't a gameplay concept that anyone's gonna enjoy, it's just reusing areas to squeeze out a little more runtime. I see no shame in immediately whipping out a guide for this section. The last level is definitely the most padded, frustrating thing in the 13 series so far, but to continue talking about this, I'm gonna have to start talking about the finale. So this seems as good a time as any to put up the endgame spoiler warning. From here, I'm gonna talk about the ending, as well as XIII-2's 3 DLCs. I recommend you keep watching, but if you don't want to know what happens, skip to the timestamp I put up. If you're still here, good choice, cause we're about to get into it. There is some good stuff here too though, so I don't want you to think it's all bad. So, Cocoon is gonna fall. That much is inevitable. The question on everyone's mind isn't if, it's when. The 5 translucent things you had to find in the last section were graviton cores, which Hope needs to make his new artificial cocoon float. Why were these hidden around random maps? Why were they invisible? Don't ask questions. After you collect the cores and give them to Hope in Academia 400 AF, he estimates that it'll take about 100 years to get it up and running, which is, coincidentally, about the same time Cocoon is estimated to come crashing down. Caius, being able to see the entire timeline, plans to use this opportunity to force Etro's gate open, unleashing chaos into the world and breaking the timeline, preventing the cycle of Yule's death. Hope asks Noel and Sarah to meet him in the year 500 to simultaneously stop Caius and raise the new Cocoon, and they set off. Alyssa, now fully aware that if their plan goes through, she'll be erased, sabotages the time gate, causing Noel and Sarah to fall into the void beyond where Caius ambushes them. He tells Sarah that it was because Etro saved them at the end of 13, Yule has to bear her curse, and says he plans to kill Etro for Yule's sake. It's in this sequence that Sarah also learns that she's just like Yule. She possesses the eyes of Etro, and when the future's changed, she'll be forced to see it, cutting her lifespan significantly and potentially killing her. Caius then runs Sarah through with a sword, which puts her to sleep in a dream world or something. Sarah rejects her dream pretty quickly and heads to Noel's to save him, but can't do much as he can't see or interact with her. Noel's dream world is just a depiction of his past. It shows us the world he came from, the end of the world. Caius and Noel seem to have a good relationship, but Caius wants Noel to kill him. Caius says it's because it's the law of the Guardians, where the apprentice kills the master, but in reality, it's because Etro's heart resides within Caius, and killing him is the only way to kill Etro. Some ancient law or something prevents Caius from killing himself, by the way, since I know that's probably what you're thinking. Noel, being one of the literal last 3 people alive, understands the true value of life, and refuses to do it, but the next day, Caius disappears. While Noel is dealing with the fact the human population just got cut down to 2, Yule also died from her curse, making Noel the last human alive. Noel wanders around, basically waiting to die, but then Sarah wakes him up from his dream and they head off to meet Hope in 500 AF. And let me tell you, 500 AF. Oh boy. So you have these floating shapes that spin around allowing you to cross these gaps. The thing is, they work on multiple different rotations, and you have to flip a switch to change these rotations. The platforms move at such an absolutely glacial pace, and you have to stand there and wait like a dumbass before you realize, no, this one ain't gonna move, and you have to go back and flip the switch again. Even when you do have it right, you could have to wait for a platform to do a full rotation, which is just so much wasted time. It's so much trial and error, so much back and forth, so much waiting. If you could just walk from point A to point B, it'd probably take about 60 seconds, but instead it's stretched out to like 40 minutes. The fact these platforms move so slow, I often stand there wondering if they're gonna move at all, combined with the fact that this area is all platforms, it's just so frustrating. After clearing it, however, we're on our final stretch, and all that's left is the final battle. There are some genuinely good character moments in the lead-up that remind me how well Noel, Yule, and Caius are written. The 700 AF cast really carried this game. There's this one scene where Noel tries to convince Caius that this isn't what Yule would want. She had no problem with her short lifespan and was glad she got to cherish the time she did together. You know, standard good guy protagonist stuff. Caius basically retorts by telling Noel to shut his fucking mouth. Noel knew one Yule. Caius knew all of them. He knew the differences in their personality, their likes, their dislikes, what they dreamed about. How could Noel possibly even pretend to speak for what Yule wanted? Dude has a point. Our main characters and Caius get warped to Valhalla, leading us to the final boss, which is, well, it's got problems. So it's a 5-phase boss fight, where phases 2 through 4 are basically the same thing. Obviously, the way difficulty curves work, the battles have to gradually increase in difficulty. Phase 1 can't be way harder than Phase 4, right? So the way this ends up going is the early phases are basically an effortless obligation as you ramp up to the real final fight. It takes so long, it's kind of exhausting by the end. To explain my point on this, I want to take a look at some game design from other Final Fantasies. Why do final bosses have multiple phases? It's kind of tradition at this point, sure, but it's a way of providing a long, satisfying finale to the player. The first form of a final boss isn't usually designed to kill you. I mean, it definitely can, but mostly it's designed to soften you up for the real fight with the second form. As you get better at fighting the first phase, you can clear it more efficiently, which increases the amount of resources you have like MP and healing items, giving you a better chance of beating the second fight. This is how the older entries incorporated difficulty outside of stat numbers. Resource management was a skill the player could master, especially for long multi-phase fights. In XIII-2, you heal after every round, and there's no MP, so this isn't a factor. It's more like fighting each phase in a separate vacuum. There's no point to Caius Phase 1. You're gonna stomp it easily, and it has no bearing on later fights. Anyways, you clear the first 4 phases and move on to the finale, where Caius transforms into Chaos Bahamut. Hang on a sec. Did someone say Chaos?
Chaos, 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 kill chaos.
This boss fight is also not designed very great. There are 2 adds you have to defeat, and after which you get about 60 seconds to deal damage to Caius himself, before they respawn and you have to repeat the process. I once again ask, why are adds often present in Final Fantasy boss fights? They add an extra dimension to the fight. They provide a secondary target to aim at during a boss battle, which adds a layer of strategy beyond hit big bad man on left side of screen. Do you focus on the adds first? Do you focus on the boss first? If you know the optimal strategy, it alleviates a lot of the challenge, but when fighting a boss for the first time, adds during the fight throw a wrench into your standard plan, in a good way. None of that is present during the Chaos Bahamut fight. You're forced to kill both the adds first before you get a minute in the ring with the big man. Then they respawn, then you repeat, then they respawn, then you repeat. It's not even all that difficult if you're the proper level, it just drags on a lot longer than it should. Thankfully, once it's over, we get some of the best moments in the game. Caius, defeated, transforms back into his human form and admits defeat. Even after all this, Noel refuses to take Caius' life. Probably also because he knows if he does, Etra will die and all that. Catching Noel off guard, and he uses his arm to shove Noel's sword into his chest. Does this count as killing himself? I don't know the details on this one. Since the future is about to change, Noel asks Sarah if she's good, and she seems totally fine. The pair gets sucked through a portal back into the real world, where everyone's waiting. I'm gonna be upfront. When I first played this game in 2012, I hated this ending. Sure, we knew when Caius died, shit would get real bad real quick, but I thought it was dumb how Sarah just dropped dead from seeing the timeline and getting so woke she fell back asleep. Then chaos breaks into the world, the timeline snaps, every part of Caius' plan fell perfectly into place, he knew it would happen all along, etc, etc. I thought it was all just contrived to bait a sequel. Now, I think it's one of the strongest moments in the game. Final Fantasy XIII-2 has been conditioning you for this moment ever since the first game. XIII-2's main villain plays the same card as 13's. If you kill me, something much worse than my existence will happen. Noel and Sarah face the same issues defeating Caius that the main party did defeating Orphan in 13. The thing is, in 13, they found a way to make it work out. Final Fantasy games usually always have a way of making it work out. And for a good few minutes, this game does make you think it worked out. A triumphant J-pop tune starts playing, everyone's smiling, and they're finally reunited after a harsh battle. That's when the game whips around and gut punches you. It's a strong moment, and it legitimately got me, even when I knew it was coming. Final Fantasy XIII-2 has a few low points, but this ending is definitely a high.
Think, Caius, think.
Lastly, I want to talk about the DLC, quickly because oh boy would I be upset if I bought these for full price on release all those years ago. Spoiler alert, I totally did that, and I was indeed upset. First is Saz's DLC episode, and I'm gonna say don't. Just don't. You think maybe you want to? No, trust me, just don't. You just play gambling minigames until you have enough coins to see a single insignificant cutscene. The only worthwhile thing to come of this is the game tells us that Chocolina, the shopkeeper, was the chocobo chick that lived in Saz's hair from 13. You know I'm not making that up, because I literally couldn't make something like that up. Snow's DLC chapter is equally insignificant. It's just a bunch of arena fights, pulling a few bosses from Final Fantasy history. Yeah, it's kinda cool when a sumo version of Gilgamesh's theme plays, but there isn't much to it when the novelty wears off. Jill Nabat gets more screen time in this DLC than she did in all of 13, though. Last, we have the Lightning DLC, which kinda leads into Lightning Returns. You play as Lightning, and the whole episode consists of a single one-on-one fight with Caius. The thing is, you're meant to lose the first few times, and you level up even after a loss. It's kinda cool, but you start having to lose quite a few times just to level up once, and it gets tiresome. I get it, I get what's going on here. This is like round 8. Can I just be strong enough to have a chance now? Once you 5-star the first fight, you get to have a go at the second, and if you beat that, you get a few cutscenes that show what Lightning was doing in the finale, where you previously just saw her encased in crystal. It's the only DLC that actually has a plot to it, but it's still pretty bare bones. The PC version comes with the DLC, but I couldn't find a definitive answer as to whether or not the recent Game Pass version does. I wouldn't suggest buying them if they're not included. Just go read the 2 sentences of plot details on the wiki or something. And that's Final Fantasy XIII-2. I promised this video would be much shorter than the last one, but it looks like I lied. My bad. Turns out I had a lot more to say about this game than I thought. Overall, I thought 13 was consistently decent. I liked the game. It had its low moments, but if you temper your expectations, it stayed pretty consistent throughout. 13-2 definitely hits higher highs than 13 does, but its lows are also much lower. It suffers from being the middle entry in a trilogy in the same way middle entries often do. It's not a conclusion in itself, it's a setup for a finale. If you ask me if I like the game, I'd say I do, but it's complicated. There are moments I truly enjoy, but there are moments like having to find the 5 invisible floating items in already cleared areas where I sit back in my chair and just stare at the floor for a few minutes. That being said, I personally believe that a game that bounces between really good and really bad is really interesting to play and talk about, so I don't regret the time I spent with 13-2 at all. Would I recommend you play it? I mean, if you played 13, you might as well see it through, right? I don't think I'd skip 13 and play only this one, but if you do, let me know. I especially want to know what you'd think about it in that case. Square Enix suffered a lot from not knowing what they wanted to do in this era of gaming. A lot of companies did. 13-2 is just another example of that. It's not irredeemably mediocre, but I certainly do have a lot of mixed feelings about it. I could see this game getting a few improvements that could make it end up being pretty great. We just don't live in that world, though. All we can do is overanalyze and talk for an hour about the game we got. Next up is going to be Lightning Returns, and while I played 13 and 13-2 back when they released, I checked out back in the day, so I've never touched Lightning Returns before. I haven't even seen gameplay of it before, so I have no idea how it's going to work only having one party member. I'm looking forward to it. Cautiously. I hope you are too. Thanks for watching this video. If you're listening to this right now, I mean. If this gets, I don't know, 1 million likes or something, I'll do a karaoke cover of Yakusoku no Basho, the game's J-pop ending theme. Anyways, see you later with Lightning Returns. And also, I guess with this timing, happy holidays. Till next time.